Hello and welcome everyone in another episode of Researchers Celebrity, powered by Empowering Science Foundation. Today, we have Dr. Lauren Esposito with us. A brief about Dr. Lauren. They have done, and currently, they are Curator and Schlinger Chair of Arachnology and co-director of Island 2030 at California Academy of Sciences. They received their bachelor's in biology from University of Texas at El Paso and master's and PhD from American Museum of Natural History, New York. Dr. Esposito is recognized for excellence in impactful biodiversity sciences, evolutionary biology research, initiative aimed at reducing disparities in science, technology, engineering, mathematics, and medicine. Their work leveraged nearly 20 years of expertise in scientific research, funding, leadership, administration, and mentorship, as well as a deep personal commitment to advance the culture of inclusive science. They are the co-founder and director of Island and Seas, a science education and conservation not-profit, and the founder of 500 QAs Scientist, a global visibility campaign for LGBTQ plus people working in science. An accomplished public speaker, Dr. Esposito has appearance in a wide range of popular media outlets, including NPR, National Geographic, PBS, The New York Times, Animal Planet, Seeker Always, and TEDx, not to loop. With this brief introduction, we will welcome Dr. Lorraine at the platform with saying thank you very much for accepting our invite.
It's my pleasure to be here.
So we always start our conversation with our celebrities that how and when you decided that you want to become a researcher.
That's a good question. I mean, I don't think I really understood that I wanted to be a scientist or a scientific researcher until I was in undergraduate, getting my undergraduate degree, my bachelor's. And I think probably my third year, I had taken some interesting courses at that point, like some entomology courses and some field research courses. And I had a conversation with one of my professors where I was telling him, oh, I don't really know what I would like to do next after I finish. And his response to me was, why don't you be a field biologist? And I was like, a field biologist? I wasn't aware that this was a profession to be a field biologist or somebody that works in the field all the time. And his suggestion was because I loved being in the field. I loved the field research aspects of the courses in zoology that I was taking. And so he encouraged me to consider getting a graduate degree and working on research as a primary profession. So I was sort of like a light bulb, I think, for me, where I was like, oh, this is an actual career path that I could become a researcher and do that professionally. And so it was, yeah, really in college. Although I always loved animals. Like I was really into being in nature and like looking under rocks and fishing and doing all kinds of things that were out in the world, just like looking at things and then putting them back. And so I think it was in me from the very beginning, from a really young age, but it wasn't until college that I realized it was an option for a career.
Absolutely. So a person who enjoys the outdoors, the biology, doing a PhD when we do talk about the museum. So we'll start from the story that when you make up your mind that you really want to pursue it to the graduate level, because
Mm.
everyone knows that graduate studies are tough anywhere in the globe, especially in United States.
Yeah, I mean, I think graduate education is hard, and I think part of me what like thought about going to graduate school because I wasn't ready to get another kind of job. I wasn't ready to work like a regular job from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. every day, and I in my mind continuing my education was a way to avoid joining the workforce. But really, I think it's much harder to go to graduate school than it is to get a regular job, because the work is kind of never done. You're not just working from 9 to 5. Um, and you're learning so much and you're really challenging yourself to improve as a intellectual, as a researcher, as a, yeah, like in many ways, many different skills that are all like a mental challenge, not a physical challenge. Um, and so I think for me, like I enjoyed some aspects of going to graduate school for sure. Like certainly like the challenging aspects in terms of challenging myself to learn new skills. But like there were other aspects of it that I found really challenging because I think it's like a mental obstacle for yourself to realize that you can finish and understand all the steps that you need to take in order to finish something like 6 years from day one. Like you show up on day one and you know that in 6 years from now I need to complete all of these steps, but that just feels impossible. And so I think that like mental barrier of understanding all the steps you need to do in order to finish is definitely was a hard thing for me.
So let's start with the imposter syndrome. That when
Imposter syndrome.
a PhD student walks into the lab, and now we have the uh,
Yeah.
possibilities of rotation. So they still take some time to settle
Right.
where they really want to join.
Yeah.
But this feeling of not belonging,
Yeah.
you experienced it or your peers, and on the basis of that, how did you overcome that?
Yeah, I mean, actually, when I think about imposter syndrome, it reminds me of the first day of my first class in graduate school. I walked into the first class. I was meeting all of my peers for the first time, and I was like overwhelmed with the language, the level of their language, like the words that they were using, that I felt like immediately like, oh, I've made a big mistake because there's no way I should be here. I don't speak the way that they speak. I don't use the kind of like long, complicated words that they use. And there's no way I'm ever going to succeed because I can't be who they are. And I think that like throughout my entire career, I've definitely experienced imposter syndrome on a regular basis. Like even now, I think all the time about like, God, what am I doing? Like somebody's made a mistake to let me in here, to give me this grant funding, to accept my paper. Um, Somehow there's been a mistake made. And so I don't, I mean, I think that the only way to overcome it is to surround yourself with the kind of culture that pushes you away from imposter syndrome. And what I mean is people is working in as part of a community, as part of a research community where people really value who you are as an individual and how your individual perspective improves the quality of the science that you're doing. And so what I've focused on as a person who now runs my own lab is really trying to create that culture not only for the people that are in my lab, like my students and my postdocs, but also for myself to realize that like I'm bringing an important perspective to the collaborative work that we're doing as a lab group. And I think that that's the best way, is to really find like your community and your working group, even if that means creating it yourself from scratch.
And I think this is something which every researcher have to struggle, because the world is full of critics and for
Mhm.
any human being on the earth. But when it comes to publications, researchers are the one who have to go through that not less than hell, when you get reviewers comments saying that whatever you thought or have done is not worth anything.
Yeah, that's so stupid. Why would you think that this is interesting?
And when you now, with your experience and now with this great intention to develop a lab, to develop a culture, how do you see that the researchers of current generation or upcoming generation, how they should approach this imposter syndrome in the first at the different stages of their career? So when they are a graduate student, when they're postdocs, in the faculty, and all of this, where, as you said, that they might feel it every day or once in a while or once in a year. But even when they're facing this or feeling this, how they
Mm.
should.
I mean, I think one of the most like valuable lessons is to remember that like you as an individual that's a part of a larger research community and system are a commodity. Like you're a commodity, which means that you have value by the nature of being a scientist and participating in the enterprise of research. And in that sort of mind, like with that mindset, I think it's possible to realize that you have because you're a commodity, you have power, and you have power in particular to make decisions about where and how you um, make an effort, or give your labor, or your time, or your knowledge, or your insight. So you can be as choosy as the people that you think or you perceive are having power. So like an example of this is, I think, one that almost everybody who decides to pursue research as a career faces, which is, how do you choose a graduate advisor? And I think most people initially, they feel almost like they're trying to convince an advisor to take them in their lab. Like, I promise I'm worth it. I'm worth being a student in your lab. I'm smart enough to be in your lab. This is the mentality that most people have, but they don't realize that the advisor needs them as much as they need the advisor, because the advisor can't do all of the research themselves. They don't have all the new ideas. They've been doing this for maybe 20 or 30 years. Their brain is like old already. They need new, fresh ideas, and certainly people to help do the work. And so I think, like, approaching every new research relationship, whether that's joining a new lab or inviting a collaborator to work with you, like remembering that you have power, and in fact you have more power than you might realize you have. That you get to be choosy, and you get to be the one interviewing the person that you would like to work with, as much as they're interviewing you, is like something that's really important, and like definitely feels empowering in terms of fighting or combating the imposter syndrome.
Absolutely. And this is one thing which I recently learned, and you just phrases out it so nicely, that when a PhD student is, or when they are looking for advisors for their graduate program, they are the one who are choosing.
Yeah,
Mostly the PIs are always looking for students. So it's the
always.
who's actually actively seeking that, okay, I want to work with this person. And here, so our audience focused in all over the world, but for the Indian students and audiences, I would like to specially mention that you have to understand that you bring the value to the lab. You bring the value to the research group, and it is you who are going to spend probably night. If not night, then all the hard work during all of your tough time of couple of years, from ranging from 3 to 5 years, you are going to spend your life in there. So you are giving more than anyone or any funding agency could have done to that lab. So
Hmm.
always acknowledge that self-respect, because one of the things which is very pressing these days, and I would like to know, Lauren, your thought about it, that when people talk about mental health, especially in graduate school, in
Hmm.
graduate students, in
Yeah.
India, what we have seen is like in 3 years, in 5 years, spending so many years of their life in a lab, they still back out. And in the very sad, and like, not to mention, but the all those sad incidences when the PhD student has committed suicide.
Yeah, it's really terrible.
So how we should stop this, or, because what we all believe is that it is not one thing which can be done overnight. But what
Right.
we believe in Empowering Science Foundation, that breaking the barrier is the first step which you have to do.
Yeah.
Talk about it. And like, now, what you suggest to the graduate students all over the world, how they should approach the mental health.
I mean, I think mental health, like, if you're not taking care of your mental health, then you're never going to be able to succeed. Your mental health is the first and most important thing. And so I think, like, one, recognizing that you have limits and what your limits are, and being able to acknowledge that you've reached a limit, and that you may need to take a step back and take time for yourself. But I think too, there's this trend in research in particular to work more than is perhaps necessary. There's been many like interesting studies, or books written by very productive individuals talking about their approach to work, and oftentimes I think what you hear over and over again is that the most productive people don't work the most. The most productive people have a healthy approach to work and life that allows them to recharge, so that they're working at like optimal efficiency when they do invest time and energy into the work that they're doing. And I think that there's this like very toxic culture that happens in science and scientific research where people feel like they have to be in the lab 20 hours a day or 16 hours a day. But the reality is those 16 hours are wasted because you can't do that every day over and over and over and expect to be doing anything that's good quality, that's productive, that's like optimal efficiency. And so I think really taking a step back and setting healthy boundaries for yourself as a researcher and ensuring that you also are pursuing other activities outside of your academic life, outside of your research life, that make you happy and give you that like element of recharging your mental ability so that you can show back up in the lab the next day and say, okay, I'm ready. I'm ready to focus. I'm ready to be like optimized in terms of what I'm doing. That way I can leave in 6 hours or whatever and go and continue my life outside of the lab. I think that that's like really important and something that FNOT is being explicitly told to students and postdocs and other early career people is oftentimes just like implied by the lab culture that they should work more than a normal job um, outside of science. But that's, yeah, I think it's unhealthy and I think it really contributes to the decline of mental health in graduate students and people who are not graduate students, you know, graduate students and beyond.
Yeah, in fact, this is one thing which we always believe that research somehow, I think I might be wrong in this, but when we see research, we don't see research as a job. We see this as
Yeah,
a passion
of
because,
life.
yeah, if you cannot be passionate every morning about your experiments, you probably are either in the wrong profession or you will not stand in this for long.
Yeah. And
Burnout.
sometimes that's just because you've been doing it too much.
Yeah, exactly. And that's why we started the topic about that burnouts are real. You
Yeah.
you create your own boundaries when you decide that, okay, now I'm done for the day. It can be only 5 minutes in the lab, it can be 5 hours in the lab, or it can be 15 hours straight in the lab. You have to decide that when you are done for the day, because as you also mentioned, that people end up spending or stretching their 8 hours to 12, 15, 16 hours and then just trashing everything because
Yeah.
brain has its own capacity after which they get saturated and then you probably are doing there all the physical experiments with nil or negative because when we say that with every failed experiment comes a little bit of stress
Yeah.
and for these things you actually are nobody realize that it's a snowball effect which keeps on
Yeah.
increasing and then all these incidences which comes out so now.
Yeah. And you become sloppy and you make mistakes. And in the end, you cost yourself time where if you would have just accepted that after the first 5 hours, after that, you're tired and you can't continue doing the same like repetitive activities over and over, you maybe need to take a break and come back the next day or after a few hours or something.
So now let's talk about the importance of organization, time management for a graduate student.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's so important. And it's something that I think most graduate students are never taught. They just learn on the job, so to speak. Like they've already started. There's somebody's like, okay, here's your lab bench, get going. Here's your stack of books, like start reading, and nobody ever really teaches you how to be organized and how to manage your time effectively. And so I think that for me, like that should be the 101 course, like the first class or workshop or guidance that you receive when you start graduate school or you start working as a researcher is how to organize your time, how to manage your time effectively, and how to keep your like journals and notes and papers and articles and citations and all of those things organized, because all of those things like really just end up taking tons and tons of time away from your research. And I think one of the amazing things about living today, like right now in this moment, is that there's suddenly become all kinds of tools available for helping to manage and organize your time, whether that's like time management organizational tools where you can set up schedules for yourself and it reminds you when you need to start and stop things, to citation managers that are fully integrated with Google Scholar or allow you to collaborate on papers. to like even some of the more interesting kind of AI tools that help with like time management efficiencies and organizational efficiencies. So I think it's a really interesting time to be alive when some of these tools are in their early stages of development and really getting to use them. I mean, I'm like so jealous of researchers that are starting out today where like they're learning to use these tools as they're learning to do science, and like it will just become sort of natural for them to integrate these tools if they start right at the beginning. Whereas like for somebody older like me, I'm learning them now, but I'm like having to change my ways in order to accommodate them, even though they're really helpful.
Can I ask you that now, as what you just mentioned, do you think that we are in the best age of doing research?
I mean, it kind of depends on what your opinion of the best is, right? Like I feel like in some ways a bit jealous of like the pre-digital age when I think people put a lot more time and thought into how to set things up and organize them in advance, so that they could be efficient and they could make sure that they were gathering all the data and information that they needed. And I think that maybe there was also more dialogue among colleagues about studies as they evolved because they were slower. And so that dialogue, I think, helped people have time to like develop really interesting hypotheses, that are now just part of the scientific literature and what we understand about like the fundamentals of science. And sometimes I worry that now things happen so fast that there's not as much time for those kinds of conversations, which can, on the one hand, advance the rate of science and means we're like in an incredible era for doing science, but on the other, I think it can be a bit isolating, actually, especially when you're in your graduate years or your postdoc years and you're really focused on your project, like your specific project. It can be like quite isolating to have that lack of conversation and dialogue and just the constant pace of data collection and more and more and more information, and like certainly like the computational aspects of it, which are all also done very individually. It's like a bit isolating, but I mean, I do think it's like an incredible moment to be doing research. And I'm excited to see what comes next.
Mhm.
But I hope whatever it is, especially coming out of the pandemic, I hope whatever it is more collaborative and more interactive than it has been, especially in the last few years.
Absolutely. And now moving ahead from graduate students to the postdocs. So, as what we know that during the graduate student lifetime, you get basic organizational skills, time management skills, but
I
about
hope.
administration part,
Yeah.
nobody teaches you most of the time. Like not every country or every university does
Yeah.
that, but there you get training for writing grants, training for reviewing papers, writing all of those. And now on top of that, because postdoc is such a intermediate stage, or rather fictional 20, 40 years ago, where you were like, okay, graduate student, and now you have a position to join and then learn from that. But now this is a bridging stage where you are expected to learn so much, publishing at the same time and
Mhm.
struggling looking for all those positions.
Yeah.
Your guidance and your experiences to these fellow researchers.
I mean, I think the postdoc stage is so weird because it's also so variable depending on what your postdoc position is. Like you can be in a postdoc position where you're basically managing an entire lab, or you could be in a postdoc position where you only work on one specific project and you're very micromanaged. The PI is telling you what to do every single day. And it could be anything in between. And so it's so varied. Like really your experience is so dependent on the exact lab and the funding that your job is coming from, your position is being paid from. And so it's hard to like generalize, what happens during the postdoc. But like one thing's for sure, which is what you said, that you're expected to learn a bunch and you're expected to publish at a really high rate, while also trying to look for a permanent job, which seems like an impossible task. Um, I actually found that like my burnout phase happened when I was a postdoc, and that maybe happens for a lot of people where they're under so much pressure that they feel like they're sick of doing research. And I made a decision to step away from research for a year and work. I was working for a textbook company that writes textbooks about science for primary and secondary students. And it was a really different experience, and it taught me some super important um, things. And one of those was work-life balance, because I went to a normal job. Everybody started at 9 a.m. They left at 5 p.m. They had a 30-minute lunch break in the middle. They went home. They weren't emailing anymore. They weren't checking a grant report and making comments on it in a Google document or whatever. They were just finished. And then the next morning they came back to work. And I think I really learned, like, for the first time, like, oh, this is what having a job looks like. Um, and I didn't feel guilty every night when I went home and did something else for the first time in many, many, many years. Because my postdoc had been quite intense and really like more work than I ever needed to be doing. And after that year, or during that year, I had the space to start to think about my next steps in my career. And actually, I wasn't sure if I would come back to do research anymore. But the position that I'm in now opened, and I applied for it and got the job. So I was like, okay, this is the job that I really, really wanted. And now I have an opportunity to come back into research, and I was happy with that choice. But I don't envy postdocs. It's such a hard place to be in. It's such a difficult position. And I think like one additional element that many postdocs experience is it's also a period in your life where like often you have changes in your family, like you get married or you have children. And so that only adds to the sort of tension in your home life. I think there's some interesting things that are happening in postdocs, at least in the US. In particular, I find that more universities and labs are having greater flexibility about where postdocs are based, so that they don't necessarily have to move and uproot their entire families in order to move to the place where they have a 2-year temporary position. So I think more people are, I guess, perhaps in response to the pandemic and in response to a growing disrest among postdocs about having to move every 1 to 2 years. There's sort of a trend towards allowing people to work remotely if that's possible with the kind of research they're doing. And I think that's really positive. I also think that there's also some movement towards greater pay equity for postdocs. Postdocs are ridiculously underpaid in the United States. I don't know if that's true, universally and around the world, but in the US it's really awful. And they're not valued for the expertise that they have at the point that they've got a PhD and like significant understanding of how to run a research lab. Even if they've never run one themselves, they still have that knowledge and that understanding. So I think, like, I hope that with increased pay equity and more flexibility around where people live, there'll be improvements in the quality of life for postdocs. But like one thing's for sure is that finding a community and a network of people, of peers, is really, really important at that level, because you don't have like the built-in graduate student community that you have as a PhD student. You're kind of more isolated, and so having like seeking out that community is really, really important.
So now just summing it up for the graduate student as well as postdocs, your thought and suggestion about two things. First, how the stress management in these two phases should be handled. And the second one, the work-life balance. Obviously, something which needs to be acknowledged and said, because one thing which is universal, that researchers in general are underpaid if we are talking about academia.
Yeah.
So 99%, yes. People like their equivalents, who are not only doctors and lawyers, advocates, but there are so many other professions where they are making at least 3 times of money what they're making.
Yeah.
So this shows so much of commitment that a researcher chose every day of their life that they want to do that.
Mm.
What we can do to acknowledge. So Empowering Science Foundation, again, going back, that how we believe in breaking the barrier. Acknowledgement is one thing which sometimes, actually, it's not all the time, but sometimes it gives them that support that, okay, whatever I have done now, at least it is acknowledged. And that is one of the very small, tiny piece of publication. Publication is one of those tiny pieces that when they're just happy, they're paying the charges for that out of their grant, and still they are happy that because now the world knows that this research group has published something which is of so much importance to the rest of the world.
Yeah.
Your thoughts on stress management and work-life balance for postdocs, early career fellows, and PhD students?
I mean, I think for one, I think one way to like in terms of like starting out with acknowledgement, like one thing that is definitely related to both work-life balance and stress levels is whether or not you're being acknowledged for your contributions. And I think probably like one of the best recommendations I have for mitigating that is having upfront conversations about when you contribute your time. Because I think like so often what happens is some colleagues or perhaps collaborators know that you're really good at something. And they know that for you, it's going to take 5 minutes of your time. And so they ask you as a favor to contribute to help with something that they're struggling with that might take them 2 or 3 days to figure out. But for you, it's 5 minutes because you're an expert in this thing. And so I think having like upfront conversations every single time about what that contribution means, because while it might only take you 5 minutes, it's taken you years to learn the skill at the level that you have it. And so you should be acknowledged for that. And that acknowledgement will help to decrease your stress because you're having more publications. You have a better job prospect, and it will help to decrease your to improve your work-life balance because you're having more papers and publications where your work and contributions are acknowledged, and therefore you don't feel like you have to work as hard to be recognized for your skill and expertise. So I think like those upfront conversations, even when they're often like feel very awkward, you have to, again, like from the very beginning of when we started this conversation, you have to remember that you're a commodity and your skills are a commodity, and you have to value your skills as a commodity in order to gain the recognition that you deserve. So I think that like for me is one of the things that's been very difficult to learn. I think oftentimes I never had those conversations because I was scared or ashamed, or especially if it's like an imbalance in power with the person who's asking you. Maybe it's your advisor or a committee member or something like that. You're scared to have that kind of conversation, like to say, okay, I'll do this, but are you going to add me to the paper? Because you're afraid of their reaction when it doesn't cost them anything to add you. They can add you as a collaborator and value your expertise and your skills. Um, and that's definitely like within my own lab, something that we're really mindful about is never asking anybody for free labor for anything, ensuring that their contributions are recognized, and that they're and have the opportunity to participate in whatever the collaboration is in the future, even if they only gave 5 minutes of their time. I think, in terms of work-life balance, it's like that's up to you. Nobody's gonna balance that for you. You have to set your own boundaries, and sometimes that means saying no to things. Sometimes it means saying, no, I can't stay late to check on the fruit fly colony or whatever the case may be. It also means sometimes calling your mom or your spouse up and saying, I'm going to be late because this is my turn to check on the fruit fly colony. So I think that there's like some give and take there, but as long as it's balanced in the end, that's really, really important. And nobody's going to provide that balance for you. Like your primary supervisor or your research advisor is never going to say, you should go home now. It's 5 p.m. on a Friday. Go home. At least most advisors and supervisors won't tell you that. um, and then I think, in terms of like sort of mental health and stress level, like that's really related to that. It's related to you understand setting boundaries for yourself and understanding when you've crossed those boundaries. And I think part of that is like just checking in regularly with yourself or regularly with a group of close people that you trust, and that you trust to both recognize when you're surpassing your boundaries and tell you that you're passing your boundaries. But it's your responsibility to listen to them.
So this brings us to next point of the power dynamics in academia.
Yeah.
Now people are starting talking about women in STEM LGBTQ plus, queers. What are your personal thoughts? Because you are in so much of, leading in this field, that what are your experiences and then how you foresee that we should approach
Mhm.
these sensitive topics?
Yeah, I mean, power dynamics are how the world works. That's the reality. We're never going to escape power dynamics because almost always there's going to be somebody who's more senior, who's more accomplished, who's belongs to a group that's been historically promoted over other groups. Um, and I don't know that there's ever a way to move entirely away from the existence of power dynamics. But I think one way to counteract the power dynamics is to name them and recognize them. And in particular, to recognize what your own, like as an individual, no matter your background, whether you're from like a high caste or a low caste, or you're a male, a man or a woman, or you're LGBTQ or heterosexual, you always have some element of your personal identity that is better off than somebody else. Almost always. I mean, maybe not for some elite groups, but recognizing and naming what your role is in perpetuating power dynamics, I think is really important, and then being aware of how that influences the way that you interact with other people. Um, and that's something that everybody has to do, and I don't know that everybody ever will. But I think that if a critical mass is doing it, then it holds other people accountable for the kinds of ways that their power dynamic play into any given situation. And in academia, one of those in particular is just the power dynamics between graduate student and postdoc, or postdoc and faculty member, or graduate student and advisor. All of those power dynamics, I think, have to be named up front. And I've seen some really great models for using mentor-mentee contracts as a way of mitigating power dynamics, because it allows you to set up expectations from the very beginning about what you do when things are going wrong. And everybody can state their preferences. Everybody has an opportunity to say how they would like to receive negative feedback. And so that you're not always like waiting to hear if you did something wrong or if somebody's angry with you. You just know from the very beginning what the dynamic is, and you've made it clear how you work best in the context of that dynamic. And so that's, I think, like something that I'm starting to see more and more is those mentor mentee contracts sort of at every stage from undergraduate through postdoc level. And I think it's just a really useful tool for helping to mitigate some of that. But I think the other big thing is really the promotion of of true collaboration, really like giving people the space to share their ideas and provide feedback, and making sure that when you receive that feedback that you're truly open to hearing it. I think that that's like a really, really important aspect of changing the dynamic of how research is done.
Absolutely. And now we will like to know the final thoughts, because now we are edging to our conversation, that what are the suggestions for the researchers all around the world, that everyone knows that everyone is human being. We try to be happy, and research gives us tough time to maintain that happiness.
Yeah.
How we can maintain or at least thrive for that happiness?
I mean, I guess there's like two questions here, which is do you want to strive for happiness within the context of research, or do you want to strive for happiness in life? And those are maybe not the same thing, right? Like
Absolutely.
striving for happiness in research is definitely like I think a lofty goal. It's a goal that like maybe you'll never attain it. I think maybe you can find the small things that you get happiness from, right? Like the moment of just sort of joy in your day-to-day activities of doing research, like the things that make you really happy. And I think for me, one of those is really like celebrating accomplishments, like not just saying like, oh, great job, like actually taking a moment to celebrate it and acknowledge it and recognize it, whether that's your own accomplishments or accomplishments of people around you, like publishing a paper. Like we don't really celebrate it, we're like, oh great, we published this paper and now we can move on to the next paper. And like often by the time it's published, you're so sick of it that you don't even care anymore. But I think like taking a step back and like finding the joy in having accomplished something really profound, which is like adding knowledge to humanity, is important. And then I think, you know, for finding happiness and joy in life, it's about making sure that you do have things outside of the lab that you like truly care about and that truly make you happy, and making sure that you protect your time to engage in those activities, whether it's like having dinner with your family or playing football at the park. You have to just protect the time to ensure that you can find those moments of joy.
Absolutely. And I think with this, we'll say to all of our audience here that the key points from today's conversation will be like the tagline which never changes is that do whatever makes you happy. So always, and if you are still doing research, so as Dr. Lorraine just said, acknowledge the efforts you put in there, be it self-respect or be it the group work that the team has done. It is a publication that, yes, by the time we all know that any paper publishes, if not 100, at least 98% of them, you are so fed up that you don't want to see that data. Don't waste all your hard work into not celebrating. Take those moments. There are labs which go for parties for every publication, but I think we need it more. How we started was like whenever we used to communicate a paper, doesn't matter we have to send it twice or thrice, we always celebrate that. Every
Yeah,
communication will be celebrated.
that's
This
great.
is our way. And then draw your boundaries because that is very important. Burnouts are real, acknowledge them, take your time, take yourself out and or in the surrounding of the people who makes you feel worth, because that is one thing which nobody should keep in your brain. This negativity is probably the biggest enemy of any living life, be it human or anyone. But for researchers, it should not, it should be just acknowledged the day you feel that you are not, when you see that the thoughts are not going the way they were. And as Dr. Lorraine said, when you go talk to your family and friends, share the feelings with them, the people who you trust, tells that, okay, this is not you. This is someone else speaking through you. The moment, and again, then whatever they suggest, you should be brave enough to acknowledge that and then follow that also.
Yeah,
With these things, we'll say thank you very much, Dr. Lorraine. It was very enlightening conversation with you. And as a part of our conversation, we always tell our audience that whosoever want to write it to you, they can write directly to you for
absolutely.
mentorship. Or if you want, you can write to us at Empowering Science Foundation, and then we will put you in connection with our researchers celebrities. With this, we'll say thank you, Dr. Lorraine, and for all the audience, stay tuned for another episode of Researcher Celebrity. Thank
Thank
you.
you so much.